"Representative Crockett, this is not your stage. Sit down." The words sliced through the chamber like glass shattering on marble. Amy Coney Barrett's voice, clipped and cold, carried the authority of someone who had never been told no. In her life, in that instant, the room froze. Even the shuffling of papers seemed to stop mid-motion. Every eye darted toward Jasmine Crockett. For a split second, you could almost hear the weight of silence pressing on her shoulders. Barrett's tone wasn't just procedural, it dripped with dismissal, the kind designed to humiliate. It was the kind of tone that told millions watching, "You don't belong here." The camera lights caught Crockett's face in sharp relief. Her expression didn't flinch. No gasp, no flash of anger, no nervous shuffle. Just a pause, measured, deliberate, the pause of someone who has lived her entire life fighting for the right to be in the room. Spectators whispered in the gallery. Journalists tilted forward, pens suspended in the air. A ripple of unease threaded through the chamber as though everyone sensed something larger was unfolding. This was no ordinary interruption. This was a power move, a public attempt to shrink her, to box her into silence. And in that silence, the stage shifted. Because Crockett wasn't just standing there for herself. She was standing there for every young woman told to wait her turn, every immigrant's child told to go back, every voice from the margins told they were too loud, too angry, too unpolished for the halls of power. Barrett's words were supposed to end the moment. Instead, they set it on fire. You could see it in the eyes of the audience, shock giving way to anticipation, indignation twisting into a hunger for what might come next. They knew Barrett had thrown the stone, but all eyes waited to see if Crockett would pick it up and turn it into a weapon of truth. And so the courtroom sat in suspended animation. Barrett leaned back, satisfied, confident she had put the freshman lawmaker in her place. The air thickened, history paused, and a hush swallowed the chamber. But no one could have predicted how Jasmine Crockett would respond next. This wasn't just a courtroom quarrel. It was a stage on which two visions of America collided. On one side sat Amy Coney Barrett, cloaked in the quiet armor of lifetime authority, a figure elevated by the highest court in the land. To her supporters, she represented order, tradition, and an iron grip on the past. To millions of others, she symbolized a suffocating establishment, a voice polished by privilege, echoing from marble halls that too often excluded those who looked or lived differently. And across from her stood Jasmine Crockett. Not a polished statue of elite tradition, but something else entirely, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic. Crockett didn't walk into that chamber carrying the weight of centuries-old institutions. She carried the fire of lived experience, the kind of fire that doesn't bow, doesn't beg, doesn't apologize. That clash wasn't about one woman silencing another. It was about whether America would continue bowing to old hierarchies or whether a new voice, sharp, disruptive, and unapologetically authentic, would finally break through. The insult from Barrett wasn't just an insult to Crockett. It was an insult to anyone who has ever been told they don't belong in the room. Anyone whose accent, skin, or gender has been wielded against them like a weapon. The stakes were larger than the chamber walls. In homes across the nation, people watched with clenched fists. Immigrant families saw the echoes of their own struggles in Crockett's eyes. Young women saw their own battles to be heard in boardrooms, classrooms, and community meetings. For every person who had been told to sit down, the moment carried the weight of history. And Barrett knew it. Her command wasn't just a dismissal, it was a test. A test of power, of whether an institution built on centuries of exclusion could still dictate who deserved a voice and who didn't. In that moment, Barrett represented the gatekeeper of a fortress America was still trying to climb. But Crockett didn't flinch. That calm silence, that measured pause, was more dangerous to Barrett than any immediate outburst. Because silence wasn't surrender, it was a warning. Crockett wasn't just enduring the attack. She was loading it with meaning, preparing to send it back with a force that could shatter the illusion of Barrett's control. The courtroom held its breath. What appeared to be a simple exchange had transformed into something seismic. Commentators would later call it a microcosm of America's identity crisis, a clash between the old guard, determined to preserve control, and the rising generation unwilling to be boxed in. And for the millions watching online, it felt personal, because this wasn't just Crockett's fight. It was theirs. Her composure whispered a message no one could mistake. If they can silence me here, they can silence you anywhere. If I can stand my ground, so can you. The drama was no longer about words alone. It was about the very soul of the American promise, who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and whose truth deserves to echo in the halls of power. And just when it seemed Barrett had the upper hand, the tension in the courtroom took a turn no one saw coming. Amy Coney Barrett did not stumble into the spotlight by accident. She was carefully groomed, elevated, and polished by the machinery of America's most entrenched power structures. To her allies, she embodied the promise of a conservative future, calm, calculated, and immovable. But to millions of others, she symbolized something far darker, the unyielding arrogance of an ivory tower, untouchable by the struggles of ordinary people. Her rise was swift but scripted. From the polished wood of Notre Dame's lecture halls to the marble pillars of the Supreme Court, Barrett's journey was wrapped in privilege. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been forced to beg for a seat at the table, someone who always knew the table was waiting for her. That confidence, sharpened over years of clerkships and conservative praise, turned into a kind of armor. It was armor she wielded not only to protect herself, but to project authority over others. Her judicial record reflected the same posture, an insistence on strict interpretations of the Constitution, delivered with an icy certainty that left no room for empathy. To her supporters, this was discipline. To her critics, it was detachment. Case after case, Barrett's decisions seemed to tilt the scales toward those who already had power, leaving those on the margins to fight uphill battles. But it wasn't just the outcomes of her rulings. It was the way she carried herself while delivering them, calm, almost condescending, as though her words were carved in stone. She rarely raised her voice, rarely betrayed emotion, and in that stillness lay her sharpest weapon, the ability to diminish opponents without ever breaking her composure. It wasn't rage she projected, it was superiority. And that superiority had been on full display in the trial. When she told Jasmine Crockett to sit down, it wasn't just a procedural command. It was the culmination of decades of conditioning, a reflex born of believing that authority was hers by birthright. Barrett had spent her career cloaked in reverence, spoken of in hushed tones, introduced as though she were the embodiment of legal purity. But beneath the polished veneer was a pattern that critics had long pointed out, a blind spot for the struggles of those who didn't come from her world. That blind spot wasn't accidental, it was structural. Barrett represented an elite worldview that saw dissent as disorder, saw disruption as disrespect, saw difference as danger. To people like her, institutions didn't need to change, the people trying to break into them did. And so, when Jasmine Crockett dared to enter the chamber with a voice unrefined by deference, Barrett reacted not as a judge protecting procedure, but as a guardian protecting a gate. In many ways, Barrett's presence was the embodiment of America's contradiction. Here was a woman who had broken barriers by ascending to the nation's highest court, yet who wielded her power in ways that often reinforced those same barriers for others. She was both the proof that progress was possible and the proof that progress could be hollow if it only opened doors for a select few. This contradiction made her the perfect antagonist for the moment. She wasn't a cartoon villain, snarling with open hostility. She was far more dangerous, a villain in pearls and polished sentences, dismissing with a smile, silencing with civility, wielding tradition as a weapon. Her arrogance wasn't loud, it was subtle. But to anyone who had lived life on the outside, it was unmistakable. The trial wasn't the first time she had been accused of ignoring lived realities in favor of legal abstractions. Critics remembered her opinions that brushed aside the human cost of policies, her speeches that championed ideals while glossing over the messy truths of inequality. And each time, she was praised by her allies for her composure, her intellect, her supposed neutrality. But neutrality, as countless voices had argued, is never neutral when it always benefits the same side. So when she turned on Crockett with that dismissive command, it wasn't a new act, it was the same act, replayed again and again, only this time in front of cameras, this time directed at someone who refused to bow. Barrett had silenced countless voices with her calm authority. But now she faced a figure unwilling to be erased. The villainy wasn't in her words alone. It was in the history behind them, the years of rulings, the cultivated detachment, the quiet certainty that she was untouchable. That was the Barrett the world was watching. That was the Barrett who believed she had already won the exchange. But across the aisle, another story was unfolding, one that would change the entire game. Jasmine Crockett's story was not written in marble halls or ivory towers. It was etched in grit, in the stubborn belief that no amount of dismissal could erase her voice. Long before she walked into that chamber, long before millions watched her square off against one of the most powerful judges in America, she had lived a life that taught her one lesson above all: nothing worth having is handed over, it's fought for. Born into a world where opportunities were never guaranteed, Crockett carried the resilience of those who came before her. Her family didn't build dynasties in courtrooms. They built dignity in communities that had been ignored, underfunded, and underestimated. She learned early what it meant to be doubted, what it meant to be told no, what it meant to fight for a place at a table that was never set for you. Education became her weapon. Law became her battlefield, while others polished their resumes. In elite circles, Crockett sharpened her instincts on the ground, defending clients who couldn't afford the privilege of power, navigating a system that seemed designed to shut them out. She wasn't sheltered by prestige. She was hardened by reality. Every courtroom she entered carried echoes of stories larger than her own: immigrants fighting deportation, families fighting eviction, neighbors fighting to be seen. That history gave her more than credentials. It gave her empathy wrapped in steel. She knew how the law could be used as a weapon, and she knew how to turn it into a shield. That duality, compassion and combat, made her dangerous to the establishment. She wasn't content to play by the rules of polite silence. She was determined to rewrite them. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett was already known for her fire. Not the reckless kind, but the purposeful blaze of someone who refused to let injustice pass unchecked. She didn't rise on charm or connections. She rose on clarity, on the refusal to bend her voice to fit the room, and that refusal often made her a target. Critics painted her as too loud, too brash, too confrontational. But to her supporters, those same qualities made her indispensable, a mirror reflecting the frustration of people who had waited too long to be heard. Her style wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth, spoken without apology. When she spoke, there was no mistaking where she stood. She didn't dress her words in deference. She didn't soften her tone to ease fragile egos. That authenticity made her magnetic to some and infuriating to others. It was precisely what made her the perfect foil to Coney Barrett's polished detachment. Where Barrett's authority came from robes and rulings, Crockett's came from survival and struggle. Where Barrett wielded elitism like a scalpel, Crockett wielded lived experience like a hammer. And it was that hammer, forged in battles both personal and political, that she carried into the trial. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Barrett represented a system that told generations of Americans to trust the wisdom of the powerful. Crockett represented a new demand, that power listened to those it had ignored. To Barrett, rules were sacred and untouchable. To Crockett, rules were tools, and if they were unjust, they were meant to be challenged. Every pause she took after Barrett's insult carried the weight of her story: the late night studying, the battles in courtrooms where she was underestimated, the sting of being told she was too much. All of it fused into that silence, a silence that was not weakness but preparation. Crockett knew the rhythm of confrontation. She knew the strength of letting an opponent believe they had won a point before tearing down the illusion. And that's why millions watching didn't see just another exchange between a judge and a lawmaker. They saw the arc of a lifetime converging in a single chamber. They saw a woman who had been shaped by every dismissal, every insult, every attempt to diminish her, standing unbowed before the embodiment of the establishment. For young women of color, for immigrant families, For working-class Americans, Crockett's presence was validation. She was proof that the system's gatekeepers couldn't bar every door, that sometimes persistence crashes through barriers. Polished smiles cannot hold shut. Her very existence in that room was a disruption, and disruption was her greatest weapon. As the silence stretched after Barrett's attack, Crockett's story hung in the air, invisible but undeniable. This wasn't just about what she would say. It was about who she was and how every step of her journey had prepared her for this moment. And that history, that fight in her blood, would erupt in one unforgettable response. The silence after Barrett's rebuke was the kind that burned. It lingered, stretched, and dared Crockett to break. For a heartbeat, it seemed like the chamber itself was holding its breath. Then the sparring began. Barrett leaned forward, her voice steady, her words clipped like a teacher chastising a student. "Representative Crockett, this chamber is not a platform for political theater. You will confine yourself to the question at hand." Her tone was measured, almost polite, but the message beneath it dripped with superiority. Crockett met her eyes, unflinching. She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, letting the weight of Barrett's command hang in the air. The pause was more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. It was as if she was letting Barrett dig her own hole deeper with every syllable. Reporters. Pens scratched furiously, cameras zoomed in, the tension thickened. Barrett's gaze never wavered, certain her authority would prevail. She had faced dissent before, and in her world, composure always silenced confrontation. But Crockett wasn't like the others who had folded under that icy authority. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost disarmingly so. "With all due respect, Judge Barrett, the people I represent don't see this as theater. They see this as their lives." A murmur rippled through the gallery. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to shift the energy. Barrett stiffened slightly, her composure cracking just enough for the cameras to catch. She attempted to cut back in, raising a hand. "This is not about," but Crockett didn't yield. She held her ground, her words rolling forward with steady conviction. "When you dismiss my voice, you're not just dismissing me. You're dismissing millions of Americans who don't have the privilege of being heard in this chamber." Gasps and nods spread among the spectators. Crockett's tone wasn't raised, but every word landed like a strike of the gavel. Barrett adjusted her posture, lips pursed. "Representative, I must remind you that this proceeding has rules. Passion does not override protocol." Crockett's eyes flashed, but she remained composed. "Protocol has never protected the people I speak for. And passion is not a weakness, it's the only reason I'm standing here today." The exchange sharpened, each sentence cutting closer to the bone. Barrett tried to pivot back to authority, repeating phrases about decorum and order. But with every attempt, Crockett turned the language back on her, flipping the supposed neutrality into evidence of dismissal. The audience could feel the imbalance shifting. Barrett's certainty began to look brittle, her insistence on control more desperate than confident. Crockett, meanwhile, grew steadier with each word, her calm an anchor against Barrett's rising frustration. Journalists whispered to one another. This wasn't just a procedural disagreement, it was becoming a duel. Every sentence was a blade, every pause a feint, every interruption a strike. Barrett swung with rules and precedent. Crockett countered with truth and lived experience. The longer it went on, the clearer it became. Barrett was trying to corner Crockett into silence. But Crockett wasn't cornered. She was circling, waiting for the opening, biding her time until the precise moment came. And the crowd knew it. They leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the clash was building toward something extraordinary. Barrett's patience was thinning, her interruptions sharper, her tone edged with irritation. Crockett, in contrast, was sharpening her composure into a weapon, refusing to give Barrett the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Every word now was a drumbeat, tension building toward an inevitable crescendo. The chamber was no longer calm, it was electric, buzzing with the anticipation of a blow no one could yet see, but everyone could feel coming. The room was about to witness a counterattack that would leave history books gasping. For a moment, it looked as though the tension would snap. Barrett leaned forward again, her jaw set, ready to deliver another reminder of hierarchy and order. But before she could even finish her thought, Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the chamber, not loud, not frantic, but deliberate, sharp, and steady. "Judge Barrett," she began, "you can interrupt me, you can dismiss me, but you cannot erase the truth." The words landed like a hammer strike. The air shifted. Conversations in the gallery died mid-whisper. Even Barrett paused, blinking, caught off guard by the clarity in Crockett's tone. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word was measured, placed with surgical precision, her cadence slow enough for the weight to settle, but firm enough to demand attention. "The truth is," she continued, "every time you tell me to sit down, every time you insist my passion is inappropriate, you're not talking to me. You're talking to the millions of Americans who've been told the same thing their entire lives." Murmurs erupted. Someone in the gallery exhaled sharply, a sound caught by the microphones and amplified into the silence. Barrett tried to interject, Representative Crockett, "the rules," but Crockett's voice rose just slightly, not in volume but in power, rolling over Barrett's words. "Rules? You mean the rules that silence voices like mine? The rules that have told immigrants to wait quietly in line while their children starve? The rules that told women to smile politely while decisions about their bodies were made without them? The rules that told Black Americans to sit down and be grateful even when the deck was stacked against them?" Gasps, nods, a tremor of applause before a gavel cracked down to restore order. But Crockett wasn't shaken. She let the interruption hang, then leaned into the microphone, her eyes never leaving Barrett's. "These are not rules," she said, pausing. "They are excuses. Excuses to keep power where it has always been. Excuses to pretend dignity doesn't belong to everyone equally." Barrett shifted in her chair, her composure showing its first crack. She adjusted her papers, cleared her throat, but said nothing. She knew that interrupting now would only prove Crockett's point, and Crockett knew it too. She pressed forward. "I didn't come here to be silent. I didn't come here to play a part in someone else's performance of order. I came here because my community sent me here, because the families I represent cannot afford to wait for permission to speak, because the young women watching me today need to know that when someone in power tells them to sit down, they have every right to stand taller." The audience was no longer passive. They were leaning forward, their energy palpable, as though they themselves were rising with Crockett. Social media feeds lit up in real-time, hashtags sparked, clips clipped, captions shouting "She sighed IT." Barrett's lips pressed together. She tried again to reclaim ground. "Representative, you are mistaken. My words were about procedure, not about you personally." Crockett's response was immediate, cutting, undeniable. "Everything about power is personal when you're the one being silenced. You may see me as just another voice in this chamber, but I am more than that. I am the voice of a people who refuse to be erased. And today, whether you like it or not, that voice will be heard." The chamber erupted gasps, whispers, suppressed claps. Barrett's gavel slammed again, harder this time, the sound echoing like thunder, but doing nothing to quiet the storm. The balance of power had shifted. Crockett leaned back slightly, not smug, not triumphant, but resolute. Her mic drop wasn't one line, it was the steady, unbreakable truth she had unfolded piece by piece, brick by brick, until Barrett's wall of authority crumbled under its own weight. And then the line. The one that would echo far beyond the chamber walls, the one replayed on loop in news segments, memes, and speeches for years to come. Crockett leaned in once more, eyes locked on Barrett, and declared, "You can hold the gavel, Judge Barrett, but I hold the people. And in the end, the people will always be louder than your silence." The room froze. Cameras clicked. The air felt electric, like lightning had just struck inside four walls. Barrett's face tightened, her hand hovering over her papers as if she could hide behind them. But there was no hiding. The blow had landed, clean and devastating. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, alive, filled with the weight of history in motion. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the ripple, the audience stirring, reporters scribbling furiously, a murmur swelling into a low roar. Even those who had entered skeptical couldn't deny it. They had just witnessed a moment that transcended politics, a moment where power shifted not because of a title, but because of truth. Barrett's authority, for the first time, looked fragile. Crockett's presence, for the first time on a national stage, looked immortal. And yet, the story didn't end there. Because the real shock was not what Crockett said, it was what happened after. The clip traveled faster than lightning. Within minutes, the courtroom exchange had leapt from the chamber's cameras onto millions of screens across the country. What began as murmurs in the gallery became a roar online. The words, "You can hold the gavel, Judge Barrett, but I hold the people," spread like wildfire, stitched into captions, hashtags, and headlines. On Twitter, hashtags surged to the top. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag people overpower. Hashtag sit down no more. Memes bloomed in real-time images of Crockett frozen mid-sentence with lightning bolts behind her, GIFs looping Barrett's stunned silence. One viral post read, "That moment when truth finally punches through privilege." Within hours, her response had become not just a clip, but a cultural event. Celebrities chimed in. A-list actors, musicians, and athletes reposted the video with words like iconic and "this is leadership." Political commentators flooded cable news panels, voices raised, debating what the exchange meant for the balance of power in America. Some praised Crockett's courage as the dawning of a new era. Others clung desperately to the idea that Barrett's authority had been unfairly challenged. But in living rooms, cafes, and workplaces, the debate was already settled. Crockett had spoken. What millions had long felt. The old guard no longer had a monopoly on dignity. And then came the grassroots response. Young organizers cut together clips for TikTok, their voices layered over Crockett's words, connecting her mic drop to their own struggles. Climate marches, immigration rallies, union drives. A teenage girl posted herself replaying the clip, tears in her eyes, writing, "For the first time, I feel like someone's fighting for me." It wasn't just admiration, it was mobilization. Within 24 hours, Crockett's office was inundated with thousands of emails, donations, and calls of support. A petition circulated demanding greater accountability in the judicial process, hitting 500,000 signatures in a single day. The resonance was undeniable. This was more than a viral moment, it was a spark. But for Barrett, the reaction cut differently. Overnight, late-night hosts mocked her silence, comedians turning her clipped command, "sit down," into punchlines. Editorials scrutinized her history, resurfacing critiques of her judicial record with new vigor. What had been an untouchable facade of composure now looked brittle, her arrogance reframed as fragility under pressure. In every corner of the country, people were talking. Immigrant families around dinner tables replayed the moment, nodding, as Crockett's words reminded them of their own struggles for recognition. College students dissected the exchange in classrooms, professors calling it a case study in power dynamics. Parents shared it with their children as proof that standing tall in the face of condescension was not only possible but necessary. Crockett had become more than a representative. She had become a symbol. Her words had lifted the weight of silence from countless shoulders. She had shown that authority, no matter how polished, could be confronted. And she had done it not with rage, but with clarity sharp enough to slice through centuries of deference. The ripple effects kept building. Activists planned rallies under banners quoting her line. Editorial boards called her the voice of a generation. Even those who disagreed with her politics admitted the sheer power of the moment. A conservative pundit grudgingly tweeted, "Say what you want about Crockett, she just made history." But the most powerful reaction came from ordinary Americans, the janitors, the teachers, the nurses, the single parents, people who had spent lifetimes being told to wait their turn. For them, Crockett's defiance wasn't abstract. It was personal. It was the validation they had craved, the spark that whispered, "Your story matters, your fight matters, you matter." And as the noise swelled, as hashtags turned into headlines, and headlines into conversations at kitchen tables, one truth became clear. This wasn't just Crockett's victory. It was a collective one. And yet, even after the echo of her words, one question lingered. In the days that followed, analysts tried to frame the moment in terms of politics, who gained, who lost, what it meant for polls and power. But for the millions who had witnessed it, what lingered wasn't strategy. It was dignity. It was the sight of someone refusing to be belittled, refusing to shrink in the face of authority, and in doing so, reminding an entire nation of what true leadership looks like. Jasmine Crockett's response wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a lesson. It revealed that arrogance, no matter how polished, eventually collapses under the weight of authenticity. It showed that institutions are not sacred because of the people who guard them, but because of the values they are supposed to uphold. And when those values are forgotten, it is the duty of truth-tellers to stand up and reclaim them. For generations, Americans have been taught to respect the gavel, to defer to robes and titles as though they hold an authority greater than human dignity. But Crockett flipped that script. She reminded the world that the ultimate source of authority is not a chair, not a title, not a lifetime appointment. It is the people. And when the people find their voice, no amount of condescension can silence it. Her words echoed a timeless truth. Power without humility is brittle, but dignity is unbreakable. Barrett had tried to wield the weight of tradition to silence her. But Crockett wielded the weight of lived experience to rise higher. In the clash between silence and speech, between hierarchy and humanity, the outcome was clear. And for those watching, the impact went deeper than politics. Immigrant families saw themselves in her defiance. Young women saw themselves in her composure. Workers saw themselves in her refusal to back down. What happened in that chamber wasn't confined to its walls. It became a mirror reflecting the possibility of justice for everyone who has ever been told to sit down. The moral was simple, but seismic. Dignity is stronger than arrogance. Truth is stronger than intimidation, and when ordinary people dare to speak, even the most powerful must listen. Crockett's moment was proof that the American promise still breathes not in marble, but in courage. This wasn't just a trial. This was America finding its voice. And that's why what happened next matters to you. So when you think back on that moment, when Judge Barrett tried to shut down Jasmine Crockett, when the chamber froze, when silence threatened to swallow her, you'll remember what came after. You'll remember the calm, steady defiance. You'll remember the line that flipped the trial, the line that carried across the country. You can hold the gavel, Judge Barrett, but I hold the people, because that wasn't just her victory. That was our victory. It was the victory of every person who has ever been told they don't belong, every community that has been told to wait its turn, every voice that has been told to stay quiet. That day, Crockett's defiance proved something we cannot afford to forget. Dignity still matters in America. Truth still matters. And when we stand together, no gatekeeper, no robe, no gavel can silence us. But the story doesn't end here. It never does. Because the power of that moment depends on what comes next, on what you choose to do with it. So here's the call. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, if you believe in voices rising over silence, if you believe America is stronger when every story is heard, then be part of this movement. Share this story. Carry it into your conversations, your feeds, your communities. Remind others that no one has the right to tell them to sit down when justice demands they stand. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because this is not just a channel, it's a community, a movement, a rising chorus of voices that will not be silenced. Together, we hold the people. And together, we make sure the people will always be louder than silence. Asterisk.